In the 7th century, the golden age of Ireland gathered strength and splendour. The dark ages of Europe continued, with a humble but sufficient way of life for the common folk. And also, in the 7th century, the new Judeo-Christian heresy of Islam burst most unexpectedly from the southern desert lands. And the story of the 7th century in Europe is the nadir, the lowest point of Europe's decline into barbarism. But in Ireland, a beautiful Catholic civilization was flourishing. This was partly due to the much milder climate in Ireland. The grass grew all the year round. People didn't have to slaughter their cattle every autumn as they did everywhere else. They were well fed, well nourished. They lived longer, and they were able to develop a civilization, and they sent out their missionaries all over the known world, all the way down to Italy and Switzerland. This was the time of the 3 martyrdoms of Ireland. Loving the faith, many people decided that they would go out and become hermits, and so they went to a remote part of Ireland and lived as hermits. But the climate and the environment was so delightful, there was no penance, so they called that the green martyrdom. They said that's no good at all. And the red martyrdom had eluded them because their country had accepted the faith without need for martyrs. So they adopted the white martyrdom. This was the worst of all. And they made a vow that they would leave Ireland and never come back for their whole life and spend their time spreading the faith. And that's what they did. When they encountered the Benedictine monasteries, they gradually adopted the Benedictine rule. And they would come into other dioceses where often the bishops were quite corrupt, but they just settled anyway and showed people how to be Christian again. The 8th century saw the pinnacle of the golden age of Ireland. It ended with the rise of Charlemagne, one of the greatest kings who ever lived. The stupendous Book of Kells was written during the 8th century. If you don't know about the Book of Kells, please Google it. It's just absolutely astonishing. And during the early 8th century, the Muslims made great conquests. The Latin West was now separated from the Greek East by this fierce and bitter enemy. The Catholic faith had been spread by martyrs. The Muslim faith was spread by armed conquest. That's just history. In the late 8th century, there appeared a great king of the Franks, one of the greatest kings of all time, called Charles the Great, or Charlemagne. He extended his kingdom over nearly all of Western Europe and began a serious revival of learning, religion, and civilization. This period is called the Carolingian Renaissance, or rebirth. Charlemagne scoured through all his realm for men of learning. Only a dozen or so were left, and some from Ireland, and he brought them all to his court so that they would be able to support each other and begin a new rebirth of learning. And then in the 9th century, just when things were pulling together, the 9th century saw the Viking onslaught upon a Europe that had only recently begun to reclaim a settled and civilized way of life. And in Eastern Europe, Bulgaria and Russia became Catholic. The Vikings didn't want to destroy, but they had run out of land and they wanted to eat. And so they made their way. Also, their religion was a very warrior-like one, and they had no problem with just coming to a place and slaughtering people and burning and so on, and then eventually settling down. In England, King Alfred the Great reigned in the 9th century. He checked the advances of the Danish Vikings, who settled in the northeast of England and became Catholic. And the Angles, Saxons, Jutes and Danes in England began to merge into one English nation. Now, the late 9th and early 10th centuries saw the papacy at its lowest spiritual ebb. You'll notice I haven't said much about the popes. Please remember that in those days, before the internet and everything, the Pope was far away in Rome, and you didn't have much to do with him. He was there, you were happy he was there, you knew he was holding the keys of Peter, and you just got on with your lives. But in the late 9th and early 10th centuries, the popes were no different in their ways from any other landowner. They didn't teach heresy, which is worth remembering. No pope has ever actually promulgated heresy, but they made no attempt to live saintly lives. Rome was far away, and they must solve their problems without Rome's help. So they'd spend their days hunting, having illegitimate children, and feasting, and just doing what a robber baron would have done. And we must remember not to paint our own history in unrealistic colours. These people held the faith. They had the papal apostolic succession, but they were not what we would call holy men. And as I told you, Bulgaria and Russia became Catholic at the 9th century, and it is believed that Saint Cyril is the one who invented a special alphabet for their language so that it could be written down. It had many sounds that were not in Latin, and to this day it's called the Cyrillic alphabet, although I'll have to just tell you, some historians say it wasn't actually him, but it was named in his honour. Now, the 10th century. In the 10th century, the Holy Roman Empire was re-established. So the Magyars invaded Central Europe, adopted the Catholic faith, and settled down as the Kingdom of Hungary. So during the 10th century, the feudal system began to develop in Europe. It was just a defence against the barbarians, and it came about just kind of informally. A group of farmers would agree to work the lands of a great warrior, and in return he would offer to protect them. So they would also go into battle under his orders at a certain level of interaction. The warrior would in turn pledge his loyalty to a still more powerful nobleman. The warriors were called knights or barons, and the system had grown naturally over many centuries, but it was in the 10th century that people began to recognise it as a formal code to be followed. In Ireland and Scotland, a slightly different system filled the same need. The members of a clan or sept were all related, and they would choose as a leader one of their clan chiefs. Smaller clans would pledge loyalty to the larger ones in return for their protection. So it was like the feudal system, but much more based on the extended family. In Ireland during the 10th century, the Viking settlements at Dublin, Cork, Limerick, Waterford, Wexford and elsewhere were developing into prosperous towns, and the Vikings were mingling with the native Irish, although new Northmen were constantly arriving by sea. And in the middle of the 10th century, the Pope crowned Otto the Great as Holy Roman Emperor. The re-established empire would now last for another 850 years, until the beginning of the 19th century. But the Holy Roman Empire had a couple of serious flaws. One was they'd forgotten how the Romans had managed to do things, and so some of their ideas would seem very strange to us. I spoke to you about Charlemagne before. He united all of Europe, a wonderful achievement, but because he had 3 sons, he then divided it into 3 and gave 1/3 to each of his sons, and the place never got back together again. And the central part had Germany at the top, the Alps in the middle, and Italy at the bottom, and that was all counted as one kingdom, and it was impossible to govern, because if the king was in Germany, the Italians would revolt, and if he went down to Italian, the Germans would revolt. So it wasn't very successful. And as I said, in the late 10th century, the fierce Magyars, now it's spelled M-A-G-Y-A-R, but they pronounce it Magyars, they invaded from the east, and at the time that they arrived, they were so barbaric and horrible that everybody thought the Huns had come back. So when they settled in a Central European location, people kept calling them Hungarians to this day. But if you ever get a stamp from Hungary, you'll see it says Magyar Posta. So their advance was halted at the Battle of Lechfeld, and they settled in the land now called Hungary. And their first king became a Catholic as Stephen I. And in the 10th century, Poland and Denmark became Catholic. The 11th century. The middle of the 11th century is counted as the dawn of the High Middle Ages. In the early 11th century, Norway and Hungary became Catholic. The life of the High Middle Ages shows a real joy of living, and a rock-solid belief in God and the church that he left behind to carry on his work. And yet at the same time, there were the fierce attacks of the Muslims at all times. So it was a mixture of a settled, prosperous and happy life, consciously modelled on the kingdom of Christ, and yet still fiercely battling a terrible enemy who understood nothing of our methods of civilization. In the year 1002, very beginning of the 11th century, Brian Boru was crowned High King of Ireland. Ireland never recovered her place as the leader of European civilization after the depredations of the Vikings, but Brian Boru did much to repair the damage done to Ireland by the Norsemen. He was a good, wise and powerful king, devoted to the church. In 1014 he led his people against the huge invasion at the Battle of Clontarf, which was a complete victory for the Irish, except that tragically he and his heirs were killed in the battle. The Irish clans failed to agree on a new High King, and this greatly weakened the country. And we must be very careful about projecting our own ideas into faraway times. People didn't exactly think of their nation as an object of loyalty, and in the Battle of Clontarf there were some Vikings and Norsemen on the side of the Irish, and there were some Irish on the side of the Vikings. I just have to mention that. But it was the last serious invasion of the Vikings when they were scattered at Clontarf. So the High Middle Ages, although I've been doing it century by century, the 400 years from the mid-11th to the mid-15th centuries could be called the High Middle Ages. It's from about 1050 onwards that mainland Europe began to advance rapidly towards building an enduring Catholic civilization. Before that, life for most people was a struggle for survival, in which the bare necessities of life were the main preoccupation. The life of the High Middle Ages shows a real joy in living, and a belief in God, and a serious attempt to model the earthly kingdom on the kingdom of Christ. And in the 11th century, the dominant figure was Pope St. Gregory VII, Gregory the Great. He fought hard and successfully against two great evils that were greatly weakening the church: simony, the buying and selling of holy things, including the title of bishop or abbot, simony, the buying and selling of holy things, including the title of bishop or abbot, and the widespread ignoring of priestly celibacy, of the ban on priests marrying, which was especially bad apparently in Germany. Both of these practices were encouraged by the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV. After many years of tussles, Henry declared the Pope deposed and threatened the bishops under his control. The Pope, however, had a stronger weapon than that. The Pope excommunicated the Emperor Henry and released his subjects from their allegiance to him. His subjects rebelled, and Henry was forced to travel to meet the Pope. The Pope went to meet him at the top of the Alps, and the Holy Roman Emperor had to kneel in the snow for 3 days, begging forgiveness before the Pope generously forgave him. He went back. That wasn't the end of the trials between them, but the Pope showed that spiritual power can be stronger than the sword. And during the reign of Pope St. Gregory VII was the Greek Schism. He had tried to heal a growing rift between Rome and the Byzantine Empire, the Greeks. He sent 2 cardinals to meditate, but talks broke down. The cardinals excommunicated the Patriarch of Constantinople, and the Patriarch of Constantinople excommunicated the Pope. The Greek Schism has lasted to the present day. And in the mid-11th century was the Battle of Hastings, where the Kingdom of England was settled more or less once and for all. The previous Saxon king, when he died, there were 3 people claiming the throne, and were several pitched battles, and eventually William of Normandy became King William of England. And at the end of the 11th century, Pope Blessed Urban II preached the first crusade to free the Holy Land from the Muslims. All soldiers taking part were granted a plenary indulgence on the condition that they remained in a state of grace. And the original request for help had come from the Byzantine Emperor in Constantinople, and the Pope had hoped that the crusade would bring the Greek Church back to friendship with Rome and heal the schism, but it did not happen, and the Crusaders took Jerusalem back from the Muslims on the last year of the 11th century, 15th of July 1099. The 12th century. During the 12th century, a truly Catholic social order founded on the Rock of Christ was built throughout Europe as never before. Gothic architecture with the Gothic arch developed in the 12th century. And the Norman invasion of Ireland began in the late 12th century, when Norman knights from Wales were invited into County Wexford by Diarmaid mac Murrough, King of Leinster. The High King of Ireland was weak, while the High King of Ireland was weak, while the Norman King of England and much of France, Henry II, was strong. Diarmaid mac Murrough had opposed the High King and had been banished by his own people. So he appealed to Henry II for help, promising future loyalty. That's been done before in history. It's never a wise idea to invite a foreign army to come and help you to get to power, because they have a way of saying, we quite like it here. And so that's what happened. But in those days you must realize you couldn't just invade a country without getting permission from the Pope. Can you believe that? But that's what happened. So in this case, Henry II sent envoys to persuade the Pope that the church in Ireland was in a poor state and that he was wanting to reform it. The Pope swallowed that story and gave him the permission. And at the end of the 12th century, St. Thomas of Canterbury lived, and he was murdered on the steps of the altar of Canterbury Cathedral by the soldiers of the same king, Henry II. And Henry II does seem to have been genuinely sorry, because he had himself flogged in public as an act of penance.